With time comes new experiences and ideas. In the case of JoJo's, that's called Steel Ball Run. 24 years into his manga career, Hirohiko Araki would make his magnum opus. The opus would revolutionize how he does his stories, everything from his heroes, his art, his villains, his side characters, the overall plot of the story being much more seinen than shonen, and in specific, his reimagining of old characters would do wonders for this part. Deigo Brando is arguably the best reimagining of these old characters, as he is the Steel Ball Run universe counterpart to Dio, meaning that he has a lot to live up to, and he does that pretty phenomenally. However, in my humble opinion, I think Deigo is leaps and bounds better than his original counterpart. That's all due in part because of Araki's new ideas and skill when it came to making Steel Ball Run, a chance to redo the past. While these characters have similarities and differences, there is a clear, better developed character here, a much better antagonistic force, a much better villain, a better Brando. Hello, my name is Now, where I feel like we need to figure out these characters is not at their introduction, but at their early points in life. Because you can't build a Brando without some childhood trauma. Now, looking at Dio, his childhood is pretty traumatic. Dead mom, abusive dad, bad household, bad conditions, bad place of living. Overall, Dio's life is terrible. However, while you can say in real life, bad conditions can lead to a bad person, with Dio, that is not the case. The story heavily emphasizes the fact that Dio's nature would have led him down a dark path. No matter how much love he got from his parents or the Joestars, he would have just turned out evil to begin with. He still would have climbed the ladder in society, he still would have came up with the heaven plan, he was fated to become a monster, regardless of circumstance. However, with Deigo, that might not be the case. Deigo is not a pure evil character archetype, he is something much more complex than that. Deigo is a child filled with this innocence and joyfulness, only to be a few pages later stripped of that, thanks to the common flock of man not treating him or his mother with any kind of respect. Due in part to Dario. I swear he is the starter to all these problems we face in both of these universes. Being a mother without father raising a child is highly difficult back in these days. Not only is it hard to raise Deigo, but it is also hard to live against people's views of you and so much more. Common or rich, people can still be cruel and evil. And because of that, Diego's mom dies, making the innocent Deigo transform into the current one we know, the one that wants to climb society to beat everybody because nobody wanted to help him or his mother, and especially against his father who threw him blindly away and never helped him or his mom when they needed it the most. After the death of his mother, Deigo would climb society, eventually reaching the Joestar Manor, after that becoming a renowned jockey within Great Britain. But all this fortune would be at the cost of others. It is pretty evident through rumors and speculation that Deigo is not a good person, and throughout the story, this is basically confirmed. Deigo steals, cheats, and beats others into submission so he can climb atop of them. Men and society are but a tool for him to abuse to further his own gain, in an attempt to get revenge on the common man and on society. Now, when comparing Dio and Deigo in terms of their early childhood, they are vaguely similar. Dio is a character who relies on show not tell heavily. His whole backstory is abusive family, and that's really it. We don't really get to see how it's abusive, or at least to an in-depth degree like Diego's, then to all of a sudden be labeled as evil for evil's sake because of fate. So none of it really mattered until he got to the Joestar Mansion, therefore making his backstory irrelevant. But on the flip side of that, Diego's backstory did matter. All of it is hyper crucial for his character. Without it, he would be nothing. Unlike Dio, who could have just shown up to the manor only for a few chapters later just to be revealed that he's evil for evil's sake. The relatability of Diego's backstory make him much better than Dio. Being evil for evil's sake is cool for a villain, however, a sympathetic villain will always outperform a villain who is just evil for evil's sake. Relatability and sympathy will always be king. Now, in all fairness, yes, Dio also wants to climb society too because of his backstory. I'm not saying it's completely irrelevant because he's evil for evil's sake, because it is still there. However, in Diego's backstory, it is emphasized a lot more heavily than it is in Dio's, giving me, the reader, or anybody, a much clearer idea on what these villains want. When it comes to the backstory department, it is clear who wins here. It is Deigo, which in retrospect makes sense. After 24 years of making manga, elaborating on a character's backstory is pretty crucial for the character, and not only that, makes them much more enjoyable to read. unlike some characters who are all over the place. Now, moving on into the bulk of Steel Ball Run, this is where things change pretty drastically between the characters. For the first couple chapters of Steel Ball Run, Deigo and Dio seem pretty similar, at least when it comes to his part 1 counterpart. However, coming to Scary Monsters and onward, drastic changes start to occur. Deigo, after being introduced to stand powers and the Holy Corpse, his hunger now evolves into something much greater. His previous ambitions were to get the money from the Steel Ball Run race and finally mark his place atop of society. However, now with the corpse of Jesus Christ in the mix, things change dramatically, as the corpse offers a great boon to anybody who wields the entire thing, as fortune will befell them. With this fortune behind Deigo, he could gain his true revenge on society. How Deigo does this is he is constantly battling everybody on that Steel Ball Run roster. Johnny, Gyro, Sandman, Hot Pants, everybody. How he will beat all of them is by his hunger. The more he wants to win, the likely it is he will win. He hungers more than anybody here. So much so that I think he's actually hungrier for victory than the main villain himself. Due to Diego's hunger and his villainous nature, it's much more interesting to read him than original Dio. Don't get me wrong, Dio's cruel nature and his motivations to take over the world were cool at one point, but they feel very flat and shallow. But on the flip side of that, while Diego's motivations and goals are very tame in comparison, they are much more impactful and have way more depth. Just the way he talks to Gyro and Johnny and Valentine just really prove this point. The best example I can use here is when Deigo defeats Funny Valentine. Diego's quick monologue about how he's crossed the line and he has finally gained victory over a high-class person shows where he was and where he is now, and it's honestly badass as hell. Part 1 Dio, and in an extent even part 3 Dio, and I would even say to even a further extent part 6 Dio, don't talk like this. After Scary Monsters and Race in the Storm, you truly do see the experience take full effect when it comes to Araki's writing. Not only do you see a character who originally was pretty okay get transformed into something much better, you also see his effect on the entire cast as it makes them better. I feel like a problem with earlier JoJo parts is that doesn't happen. There's not a lot of character development that actually shows up, but in part 7 it is pretty heavy with character development everywhere. Deigo is actually the prime source for that a lot of the time. Without him teaching others to hunger, the story might not be what it is right now. Peak fiction. The only version of Dio that even comes close to Deigo is that of part 6, because after 20 years of being a character, he actually gets some development. However, the crazy jump from part 1 Dio to Heaven Plan Dio in part 6 is kind of crazy because there's not a lot of development that takes place during that. Just a massive jump in character with no good explanation. Other than, I've sat at the bottom of the ocean for 100 years, I've changed. That was all off screen, by the way. While on the flip side, you always see Deigo constantly changing on screen. Having Dio show up in parts and not have a lot of screen time will have side effects. And I think one of the biggest side effects is the fans and the audience just having this weird idea of how Dio works. What especially makes that worse is the fact that it's not him physically showing up part to part. It's either a passing mention or a crazy jump in character, only to wait for several more parts until he shows up again. And in said part, he's not talking like his part 3 counterpart at all. Part 6 Dio is really weird in retrospect. I'm being so dead ass. Deigo clearly takes the character development and the consistency part of this video hands down. So now moving on to the later half of Steel Ball Run, this is where I think a lot of interesting character points for Deigo start to crop up that Dio never had. The major one being is teaming up. Dio never teams up. Other than part 6 is the only time he teams up with somebody, and even then I don't think that's even a team up. I think that's a brotherhood thing going on there. However, Deigo does team up, in fact, multiple times. We see with Soundman that Deigo is one-sided when it comes to his team ups. He still views people as, well, part of society and will use them as tools to further gain what he wants in this world. But in other occasions, like with Hot Pants, there are glimpses of where the team up actually could be successful, where both parties get what they want and neither has to be, you know, critically injured for a goal to be achieved. There is a glimpse of hope for Deigo when Hot Pants truly offers him political power if she just gets the corpse, on top of giving Deigo the information of where Dario is. Deigo could have it all and doesn't even need the race. And for the most part, it almost nearly works. They basically kill Valentine. If it wasn't for plot shenanigans, Dio could have got all of it. But actually knowing him and his track record with partners, RIP Magenta, Wikapipo, and Soundman, that probably was not going to happen. But however, in a writing standpoint, the fact that I almost believe that means that it was was good. The real reason why I like these team-ups is because it shows who Deigo truly is. If he cannot treat one person with kindness, he's not going to treat society with kindness. That point previous was already clear to begin with, seeing how he thought of society, but basically after these team-ups, it makes it crystal. Part 1 Dio never gets this type of attention nor deeper look at. Sure, we get moments where he rejects his humanity and does awful and cruel things, and while yes, some of them do have major importance to the character, a lot of the time, they're just there for shock value. When you finally compare the characters of Part 1 Dio to the majority of Deigo that was shown in SBR, it's a night and day difference. There is a clearly better written villain here between these two. It's Deigo. Everything from backstory, character development, consistency. I genuinely and honestly think that Dio only has like 2 good moments in all of Part 1, that being him rejecting his humanity and him admitting to Jonathan that he is his other half. But when you compare it to Diego's history and what he does during Steel Ball Run, his interactions with Gyro, Johnny, Valentine, Hot Pants, and his individual moments to himself, he just has a lot more to offer. But moving on forward to characters like Part 3 Dio with a mix of Part 6 in there, comparing it to Alternate World Deigo, things get complicated pretty fast. So sadly, during the fight between Hot Pants Deigo versus Valentine, Deigo dies. However, a few chapters later and being put under the infinite rotation, Funny Valentine has to resort to his worst case plan. Bring back Deigo Brando from a parallel world to get the corpse parts and make it America's, so the US may have fortune and never misfortune. The alternate world Deigo in question actually in this reality has the world, and throughout its entire version of its Steel Ball Run race had this stand, but basically is more or less the same character. With alternate Deigo now in this world, a final battle between Johnny and him can now occur. But the crucial highlight for Deigo within this fight is the fact that he is willing to sacrifice a part of himself to win. It just goes to show what he will do to achieve his goals and dreams. He treats no man as equal and will quite literally give an arm and a leg for what he wants. He beats Johnny Joestar, a very rare occurrence for a villain in this franchise to beat the hero, and successfully gets the corpse into the vault. But Deigo comes to learn a hard lesson. The more you hunger, the more you'll be less satisfied. And in his hubris, lets his guard down against Lucy Steele, who has his base world corpse in a bag. The bag then proceeds to collide with Deigo, and the rules of D4C's ability kicks in, and he dies in a furious multiversal explosion. In a way, I would almost describe this as an Icarus tale. Always hungering, always wanting to reach a higher level, always trying to reach the top of the world was going to have its consequences. Diego's metaphorical pterodactyl wings could not take the heat of his dreams, and he fell because of that. It is truly poetic, the story of Deigo Brando, a man who wanted so much from the world, never got it, and then tried to take it away from the world, only to be burned by it. The same could not be said for Part 3 Dio. Not because he's not a fantastical written villain, it is because now they are 2 different characters. Deigo is written to be a parallel to Part 1 Dio, and to a slightly further extent thanks to the world and stuff, a callback to Part 3 Dio. But when it comes to character motivations and who they are, they're really truly the opposite at this point. One character is still trying to solve one's own personal goals, while the other side, one is basically a philosopher trying to figure out the mechanisms of the universe and then trying to surpass them to eventually control his fate and so many others. However, they are still comparable because they represent the ending. The world means the end in tarot card meanings, so when a character like Dio and Deigo show up, they symbolize the end of the story. And with that, they both do it pretty well. While I'll say Deigo is not the main villain of his story, he is a pretty significant one that can end it off. With him being defeated, nobody knows about the Holy Corpse. The only people that know about it now are the good ones, Johnny, Lucy, and Steven Steele being the only ones left. The corpse now finally being protected. On the flip side of that, Jotaro defeated Dio. The Joestar family can rest from fighting him personally. Overall, when you are comparing the world portion of these 2 characters' arcs, they are vaguely similar, but also vaguely not similar. This is due in part to the fact that Araki was trying to rewrite a Part 1 character with Part 3 elements at the very end, so it feels very weird. In my opinion, I don't think you can compare them anymore, past them being the grand finale or the enders for their parts respectively. When you look at their characters at this point and their stories respectively, Deigo is still a man trying to climb up top society to be number one. While on the other hand, Dio is this reclusive, high-thinking philosopher figure who's trying to figure out the mechanisms of the universe, while granted being a complete douchebag, to then rule over humanity. Basically meaning one villain is a much grander version than the other. So in my opinion, I don't think they're completely comparable anymore. However, in the areas they are comparable in, I think they're pretty much even, if not really good at what they do, that I really can't choose which one is better. You can clearly tell by now, the farther we get in with Dio, the better Araki got with his writing, which makes it for me much harder to choose who I think is better. When you compare both these characters in their totality to each other, you start to clearly see how Araki's experiences and ideas when it comes to writing really take effect here. Do not get me wrong here. I love Dio. He is one of my favorite JoJo villains. However, a thing that I've always disliked about him is how inconsistent he is. The massive change in character does feel really weird for a JoJo fan like myself who has read this series constantly over and over again. In a really meta way, pun intended, Araki is always trying to solve his past mistakes by trying to rewrite them in a better way in the future. Part 6 Dio being a pretty good example of that, and to a further extent, technically Deigo being the greatest example of that. Deigo has almost every category over Dio other than literal main villain. That says a hell of a lot when it comes to characters. Deigo Brando is an example of what happens when an author tries to rewrite something he has much more experience in now than he did previously. The better Brando was always Deigo Brando. Well, that's all I have to say. Like, comment, share, subscribe, follow me on Twitter, stay hydrated. See you in the next one, ladies and gentlemen.